A lot of people struggle with actually finishing their music, and I can relate. I have countless of demos on my hard drive that beg for attention, but I have also finished songs, albums and other projects, not to mention over 350 YouTube videos. In this video I will give you a bunch of advice and strategies on how to finish a track. It draws both from my knowledge as a creative and a music producer, but also from being a psychotherapist and university teacher. Some people will simply dismiss any talk of why you can't finish something as an excuse. This is what we call the fundamental attribution error. People often underestimate situational factors which determine behavior, and they overestimate the importance of character of the individual. This is why people are quick to call you out for making excuses, even though there are many valid reasons why you are not making progress. Most of you aren't lazy. It's not necessarily a character flaw that is keeping you from finishing stuff, but rather some unknown factor. So it's very important to reflect on why you are not making progress. Lack of time and/or energy. I put these two together since they are often two sides of a coin. Lack energy but have plenty of time, or a lot of energy but no time. Ultimately, both sides to the coin requires that you prioritize in your everyday life. Here are rarely any shortcuts. You have to look at what you're doing and figure out what changes need to be made. Let's be frank. Many of you play too much video games, have other conflicting hobbies, or simply work too much. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that prioritization is easy. I know, because I too live a sort of unbalanced life, but this is often something that is overlooked as a reason why you are not making any progress. Lack of motivation. This is usually in the form of not having a valued goal. You simply have no good long-term reason to finish your music. So you get stuck with short-term feelings of satisfaction from your jams or your demos. This means that it's time to reflect on why you are making music and what you want out of it. Think long-term, perhaps 5 to 10 years. What do you want to get out of making music? Whereas goal setting is good, developing an integrated reason to do anything can take time. The goal alone is not enough. It's not something intellectual. The goal needs to be valued, integrated as a meaningful part of your life. Conflicting motivation, meaning that there are other goals which simply conflict with getting your music done. Maybe you are doing too many things to realistically make progress on everything. And this is not the same thing as having too little time or too little energy. It's a matter of letting go of things that you might enjoy in order to pursue some other task that you deem more important or that you value even more. It's important to remember that we live in a time where people demand a lot of their life. Maintaining a perfect Instagram-worthy life, as well as working out and being an artist, and maybe you have a family on top and God forbid there be any issues with the family, these are not always easy things to combine, and you might need to remove something. Because most of us do not have the luxury of doing everything, so therefore there needs to be sacrifice. There are definitely an advantage to knowing composition and music theory, as well as producing and mixing skills, and if you get stuck at certain points, advancing your skills in a particular area could do wonders for the rate at which you finish things. So go back and look at your process and see, are there gaps in my knowledge that I need to fix? And while we're on the subject of knowledge, let's talk about today's sponsor, Skillshare, who made this video possible. Skillshare is an online learning community for creators with over 25,000 classes, and there are plenty of classes about, for example, music production and music theory. If you get premium membership, you get unlimited access, so you can join the classes and communities that are just right for you and the goals you want to reach in 2019. And at $10 a month, it's an affordable service. My viewers know that I love coffee, and I've actually taken a course about coffee on Skillshare, as well as this introductory course to Ableton Live. And if you want to try out Skillshare, use my link in the description. The first 500 who uses it gets a 2-month trial. Next up, let's talk about procrastination. True procrastination is very problematic. This is when your procrastination has developed into a self-defeating routine. If you just waste time on random things instead of getting stuff done, a real helpful routine is your best option. Write down what you're supposed to be doing and when. Remove distractions, turn off your phone, close the door, turn off the internet, and work. And even if it gets tiring, boring, and you want to do something else, you have to keep at it. Because you need to defeat the procrastination with a real and helpful routine. And once you have developed a routine that will actually make you able to work, then you can start working towards a particular goal that you have in mind. Perfectionism. This is a word that is used a little bit too freely. Wanting to perfect what you work on is nothing odd, but when your thoughts about your craft not being good enough starts getting in the way of actually achieving anything, well, then we have a problem. This is a form of unstable self-esteem, and besides seeking professional help to deal with it, this is what I suggest that you try. Whenever you are about to release something into the world, write down your absolute worst fears, then release your video or music into the world, and after a week, you compare your absolute worst fears with the actual result. Work while it's hot. I find that the longer I stick with a short loop, the less likely it is that it will actually turn into a song. Therefore, I always try and make a progression quickly, as I know that the energy will dwindle the longer I sit with a loop. And if you don't start turning it into a song, you simply won't know if it holds up. So try not to judge it too quickly, as you can't very well know if the loop could lead to a good song if you don't try. Make many variations quickly. This ties into working while it's hot, and I often try and record multiple variations of different parts as quickly as possible to get more to choose from. So in my DAW, for example, I often duplicate loops 4 times, adding stuff, removing and changing in order to create variations very quickly. Next up, we have some real beginner advice. Learn to use a DAW in a linear mode. For example, in Cubase, the linear mode is the default mode, and in Ableton you have the arrangement view. This lets you think in terms of progression, whereas something like a Digitact, a Circuit, or SL Mark III sequencer means you'll be thinking in terms of shorter loops. Moving from loops to a progression is a very important step in learning to make songs. But if you're stuck with something like a Digitact, for example, or Circuit, there is a simple solution. Make sure you quickly copy and paste your patterns, creating actual space for you to work on. So if you start with a beat, copy it onto 4 other patterns and quickly make variations to it to make sure that you are starting to working on a progression of a song. And it's also very important to chain patterns together when you are writing melodies, for example, or drums, so that the loops aren't too short. So in essence, learn to use tools that lets you think in terms of progression and not loops. Next up is one that you really don't have to agree with, but I think that you can always finish rhythms later. So some people start with the rhythm sections and other with the bass, or some with melodies or chords. But if you're struggling, I would say leaving the drums for later can work. But you will of course eventually need to create variations to the drum section, as well as build-ups and breakdowns and fills and other things to make it interesting. It's just that for me it's an easier way to add drums later, because when I have a melody I know that my chord progression and melody works, instead of spending hours on drums and then eventually not finding a melody that fits. Don't try and perfect too early. Your loops doesn't need to be masterpieces before you even know that you have a decent song going. Don't start to mix too early. This is really one of the pitfalls. Now, some people can manage to mix as we go, but try and stay away from it if you're not really finishing your music, because it can get in the way of you actually turning that loop into a song. Now I would differentiate between adding effects and actual mixing. For some sounds you might want to add effects early on to get inspired, so that's one thing, but don't start adding compressors and EQ and other things too early in the process, because it will get in the way of you actually turning that loop into a full song. Develop a routine. When I interviewed Cuckoo, we spoke about the importance of actually going through all the steps of a creative process in order to actually develop a routine. The more you do something, the easier it will get. But if you get stuck at one point every time, it will be really hard to develop what you're doing. If you find yourself having trouble finishing your music, maybe you should force yourself to finish stuff even if you don't feel like it, in order to experience the whole process, even if you're not even happy with the end result. Sometimes it's all about that journey. Talking about routine, being organized can be very helpful. I know some of my producer friends, for example, use Excel or similar tools to keep track of their music and what needs to be fixed on each track. As your project gets larger, you might need to organize things in order to know where in the process you are. For example, if you have an Excel sheet, you might want to write down the working title, tempo, style, where in the progress you are with that track, and what actually needs to be fixed currently. Have a release plan, because setting deadlines works wonders, but not if those deadlines are arbitrary. Make sure you have a clear idea of what you want to do with the music when it's finished. Are you just posting to SoundCloud, Spotify and iTunes and then people are supposed to just magically find it? Or is your ambition to send it to labels or post it somewhere? You know, having this plan helps you focus, and it also helps you with the reception and getting that reception that you want. So write a list of people and places where you can actually promote your music in a good way, but also avoid places where you might get a bad response, as it will hurt your future motivation. So having this clear idea of where your music is supposed to end up and what you're supposed to do with it in order to promote it is super helpful, because it makes the deadlines seem less arbitrary. Next up, we have a bit more of a dramatic suggestion. If you find yourself hoarding demos, maybe you should consider simply deleting stuff. If you truly do not feel a demo, why keep it? I know, because I had a ton of loops spread over multiple hardware sequencers, and one day I just felt like deleting them all. So I did. I realized that having them there took more energy, as they were unfinished potential songs, but I also realized that the likelihood of me actually finishing them was so small that it didn't outweigh the mental burden. Then of course you could simply back stuff up instead if you don't want to be as dramatic as I am, but there is a bit of commitment to it that I like. There's a commitment aspect to actually deleting stuff. It is you saying that this is not good enough, this won't ever turn into anything of value, and that you want to focus your energy on other things. See, goals and what you value is sort of a theme in this video here. So next up we have a very important piece of advice, and that is, do not buy new gear. Like, if you have trouble finishing your music, do not buy new gear. It will not help you finish your music if finishing things is the issue. But then again, it's a lot of fun having a lot of stuff. So I'm not the one to blame anybody for buying a lot of stuff, but yeah, don't buy new stuff, okay? It will just set you back in terms of learning and workflow, and yeah, it's not a good idea. Next up we have some viewer advice from Irvin, and he wrote a comment about his workflow which was very inspirational to me. The idea is to create a template with a lot of building blocks already in place, from which he can quickly create something new, having sounds, loops, even MIDI files and routings all set up and ready to go is actually very practical. If you look at how some composers work, for example, they often have templates set up so that they can get right into the music making, scoring, instead of spending hours setting stuff up. So this could be something you could try if you're not really moving past the odd loops. The next piece of advice is really obvious to a lot of you, but some need to hear it again. Learn your gear. Set aside time to properly learn each piece of your equipment. Force yourself to make, say, at least one track with each instrument by multi-tracking, for example. And this is a way to improve your skills, but also developing a sort of self-discipline. Another great idea is to partake in Facebook group or forum challenges. The social support and having a meaningful place to release the music can actually make a big difference for your motivation to actually finish something. Next up, we have a little bit of a mental strategy, and that is to remind yourself that one man's rubbish can be another man's treasure. Don't evaluate too much yourself. My father, who's a writer, often said that you create something and then it's up to others to value it. So don't spend too much time evaluating your own art, especially if you have trouble releasing it. Remind yourself that you can't cover all the bases. It can't be perfect. You simply have to let others judge what you do and if it's any good. The next piece of advice is something that I've heard from several professionals. Don't listen to your demos unless you're ready to work on them. Because when you're listening to your music all the time, it will make it harder to make changes to that music. And you're not taking advantage of the creative energy you get when you revisit a demo and find things that you want to change. This is of course different from listening to a mix, which you might need to listen to on a different system to get an idea of what to fix. But when it comes to songwriting, listening to your demos all the time is not very helpful. The next piece of advice might be fairly obvious, but it's something that you could consider, and that is organizing your workspace. Basically what I do is I look at what I have around me and ask myself, does this setup actually help me get going and finishing things? And even though I might have an intellectual idea that yeah, this workspace is really cool or this should work, I always look at the outcome. Do I actually end up working? Do I actually end up finishing something? And if I don't, I try and change my workspace so that it actually fits my needs. And this is something you develop over time, but it's something also to be mindful of. So be sure to look at this and reflect. Does my workspace actually work in my favor, or is it a problem? Now we finally arrived at the last piece of advice, and this is a question that was posted to my Instagram, instagram.com/BoBeats. And it is, how do I know when something is finished? My answer is that you don't. It's not an intellectual question, but a question of the heart. And through practice of going through the process from start to finish, you develop a sense of when it's done. But it's not something that we can quantify. You just have to go through the motions many times, develop a skill set, and from there you learn to trust your feelings and the feeling that tells you that yeah, this is good enough, this is done. So these were a bunch of tips and strategies for actually finishing your music. If you found some of them helpful, please let me know in the comments. If you have ideas and thoughts and stuff that works for you, be sure to drop a comment as well, because I know a lot of people are reading the comments and that they find it very helpful. And as always, be sure to check out the sponsor of this episode, Skillshare, and use my link in the description if you want to. So thank you so much for being here, and I hope you have a super pleasant day. Now go and finish some of that music. And I'm going to go and finish this video because yeah, I prioritize this over releasing my music. But I do have a lot of music over at Bandcamp if you're interested, so you can go and check that out as well if you want to.